today's installment of Most Disturbing Books, we are examining a scenario that should be familiar to every single avid reader of the disturbing and transgressive. Someone tells you, dude, I know you love fucked up books, so you should read blank, because it's totally messed up and stuff. And then you get yourself a copy with your hard-earned money, and then you sit down expecting a truly confrontational and visceral read. And once you turn the last page, you slowly let the book fall from your weakening grasp as you say to yourself, that was it. Yes, what disturbs us is very subjective, so this list is not based on the subject matter per se that these books cover. For instance, I know many are incredibly off-put by written accounts of animal cruelty, though that has never quite shocked me to the same level as some people express. So, even if a work's themes don't particularly disturb me, recognizing the writing skills behind it is still a surefire way to let me know that even if not with me, this work would absolutely resonate with someone else. Instead, for this list, we are going to look at the actual mechanical and stylistic qualities of the books and how, in my opinion, they absolutely failed at truly grasping the disturbing nature of their subject matter. And yada 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 yada, I'm trying to make my intros shorter. I think it's self-explanatory, so let's roll, gang. But I guess I should also say that these are just opinions, so if you are a fan of any of these works, I do not judge your personhood or character based on that. Instead, I judge you for other stuff, like where you were on January 6, 2021, etc. So please don't leave hate comments, or if you do, well, shit, what am I going to do about it, right? Number 1, and this is a great time to let you know that these entries are only in alphabetical order by author's last name. So here we have Watership Down from 1972 by Richard Adams, which was famously adapted into a grueling, soul-wrenching animated film in 1978. Although it's usually the film, I feel, that gets touted around in many of these disturbing lists, I do believe that I eventually failed to reading the novel due to it having been introduced to me with a similar reputation. Now, I think the film is phenomenal, and it's one of the best disturbing films, the usual ones, that I have ever seen. And I do admit that perhaps my dislike for the novel is due to my love of the film. To me, there was just something a little too practical, I don't know, about the way Adams imagined his Lapine community in his novel. And it just never really rose past the level of tedium for me. To me, the film had this dynamic tension to it, and you could truly imagine the small, frail lives of the rabbits in a way that made their circumstances really grueling and terrifying. But here, it just felt like a bunch of country blokes talking to each other, until 8 pages into their conversation, you remember, oh yeah, they're supposed to be rabbits. And I also have to say, in certain ways, this novel is also classified as a fantasy novel. And indeed, one of the common fantasy tropes that it utilizes is a fictional Lapine language, or Lapine, I'm not sure how you pronounce it, complete with a glossary in the back. And one of the banes of my existence is having to consult glossaries while reading a book. Unless it's a work of nonfiction philosophy or literary criticism and I must consult the references as I work through the text, I just don't care. So again, I admit that the things I dislike about this book are not things that this work was even necessarily pursuing at times, I dislike how the animal imagination is not taken to greater, more inventive heights. But hey, I don't think that's what Adams was going for, right? I dislike glossaries, etc., but others don't mind them at all. So I think, if anything, this first entry just serves as a great example of the fact that sometimes there's just great, critically lauded literature out there that simply isn't going to work for me, even if the themes that it explores are disturbing. For number 2, I want to talk about 2019's The Slob by Aaron Beauregard, and to me this is a prime example of a work of extreme horror that desperately wants to have its cake and eat it too, and just fails at both. So the narrative starts with this heavily character-driven account of a woman who, facing difficult financial times, she begins making a decent living as a door-to-door vacuum salesperson. However, everything goes to shit when she knocks at the door of the Slob, who is like this foul, burgeoning psychopath with poor hygiene, who then takes her, kidnaps her, and does extreme horror stuff to her, and very exaggerated, ridiculous, anatomically incorrect extreme horror stuff, I would say. So as I said, here's where the book tries to have its cake as a character-driven, interior journey into depravity and debauchery, right? That's how it's posited, at least, with mounting dread and mounting empathy towards our main character, or at least that's what it's trying to achieve. But then Mr. Beauregard said, no, I also want the extreme bizarro stuff that writers like Ed Lee and Robert Devereaux bring to the table, because I think that's cool. And so in the second half of the book, the main character that we devoted so much emotion to essentially becomes a bloody ragdoll, and the narrative just becomes, you know, the usual constant monotone boilerplate transgression, complete with, you guessed it, dead babies. I don't know why there's always dead babies in all of these books. I guess the whole dead baby joke era really cemented itself as a formative writing experience for a lot of these authors. I don't know. But you know, when this second half of the narrative hits, of course, we don't care, because why would we when it betrays the kind of story we were promised? And not in a good way, I might say. You know, it's not one of those like meta betrayals like you see in Scream. It doesn't feel like a twists and turns meta narrative. Like the book just kind of feels like you're playing Scrabble, and then halfway through a kid comes along and flips the table over and says, I want to play Call of Duty. And it was right at the point where this one character appears and she has no lips and yet is able to speak perfectly intelligible English. That's about where I checked out mentally. So basically, it wasn't tense or interior enough, I feel, to be truly disturbing at that psychological level it was aiming for. And then it was also not committed enough to the bizarre glee of its details to be fun, kind of like Ed Lee type affair either. The book is just kind of two incomplete halves trying to be held together by tons of blood and poop. But as we know, blood and poop don't really make a very good adhesive. The fuck is that sentence? I never said I was a good writer, okay? So up next is Wade Garrett's Insane Bastards from 2018. And this will be a short one because I don't really remember any of it. All I know is that it was bad, and it took the philosophy of the second half of the slob and just multiplied it by 1,000. Extreme horror authors, for some reason, really love reaching a point in their book where they go, you know what, I didn't want to tell you this, but my mind is actually super fucking twisted. Let me show you. And then they proceed to disappoint. There's something seriously wrong with the book, I feel, when you wade through, no pun intended, just constant violation, monstrosity, and relentless murder, and the most you get out of it is, wait, which character was that? Wait, what are we at right now? What's going on? What's the plot again? Oh, and the grammar in this? Baby. And another thing I want to note about this book, I think I found it at the bottom tier of like a disturbing books iceberg. So that should hopefully tell you that most of those disturbing books icebergs are total bullshit, and they're mostly put together by teens who haven't even read the book and they're just reading the synopses off of Google. So number 4 is 2004's Survivor by J.F. Gonzalez, which is often lauded as a seminal work of our current extreme horror trend, and judging by how terrible it was, I believe it. Now, J.F. Gonzalez, who is sadly no longer with us, is actually highly regarded as a horror master, to the point where there is an entire horror literature lifetime achievement award named after him. So I'm always willing to admit that there could always quite simply just be something here that I missed. And I also say that coupled with the fact that this often seems to get really positive reviews from horror readers around here. However, this was my experience reading Survivor. It read like a Lifetime movie, you know, complete with all the choppy, unnatural dialogue and nonsensical plot progression, and then the actual snuff film bits, and this is a horror novel about snuff films, by the way, they were just brief, uninspired, like the same stuff you'd expect to read in an edgy teenager's notebook. Let's be real. And I kid you not, there is a scene in here where our main character is kidnapped and then told by one of her captors that she's about to star in a snuff film. And of course she starts panicking and asking the usual, who are you? Why are you doing this? And well, the dude then proceeds to have a sit down and explain exactly who he is and why he's doing this, just deflating all sense of mystery and dread, and providing us with some of the most cringe-worthy descriptions of sadism that I have ever read. That scene pretty much sets the tone for the rest of the novel's extreme hijinks. I don't know what everyone else is reading or how they're processing this shit, And I kind of feel like a crazy person for being the only one that's ever said this on a review of Survivor, but seriously, in my opinion, don't read this. It's awful. It's so badly written. It's so boring. And the people that say otherwise, well, I don't know, but I have a hunch. And it's why I think that the following is an important dialogue to have for these kinds of books. So I think a novel like Survivor, I guess, promises nothing but shock and gore and extreme violence. Now, does it have that? Sure. Very badly written and uninspired, but it's there. And there are readers who are solely looking for that in their reading. And when they find it, I guess they're shocked and terrified, and it legitimizes the novel and its purpose in their eyes, I feel. For me, however, and I'm venturing to guess for most of the people who watch my channel, seasoned searchers of disturbing literature, that kind of response is no longer possible, no matter how graphic or how extreme the novel tries to be. So for people who are no longer shocked by the mention of a dead and mutilated baby, what is there left in this novel, 30 pages describing how the main character is going to make a bank withdrawal. No, I'm not kidding. That's in there. At number 5, we've got 2021's Things Have Gotten Worse Since I Knew What You Did Last Summer by Eric LaRocca. I reviewed this on my channel before, so if you want my expanded thoughts on this novella, you can check that out. But basically, there were two main things that bothered me about it. Its derivativeness and its tone. Now, as far as derivativeness, I just felt like the book plays with queer tropes that are too on the nose, especially concerning BDSM. And moreover, I also felt that this was a bit of a rip-off or homage to The Sluts by Dennis Cooper, which is awesome, of course, because we love Dennis Cooper around here, but reading it just made me want to read The Sluts by Dennis Cooper again. Now here I have to say there is absolutely nothing wrong with ripping off other works when creating your own. That's pretty much all my writing is, for instance. However, this is where we introduce the second problem that I had with this story, which is that I think it really fumbled the tone of what makes a work like The Sluts great. The novella just felt overly serious, but to a pompous extent, and missing so much more of like that delicate, tender transgression that Cooper envelops his frail characters in. And it did not feel like it had enough time to breathe as a murder mystery or work as a shocking piece of transgressive fiction. And then, when it came to the ending, I noticed another important tonal element totally missing, the humor. So I was just thinking, remember when Dennis Cooper explored the morbid extent of men's virility to the point of absurdity in The Sluts? For instance, when he describes murder fantasies concerning Nick Carter from the Backstreet Boys. I just felt sort of cheated reading a novella about an apple peeler and a tapeworm baby and not laughing once. So essentially to me, when this novella needed to be serious, it felt too pompous, and when it needed to be campy, it felt too serious. So just simply missed crucial marks for me, and as always, that's okay. Number 6 is Delta of Venus by Anais Nin, and this was published in 1977, though I believe the stories are from earlier. I can't stand this woman's writing. I'm so sorry, but I cannot, in good conscience, say that this was anything other than a total bore to read. Now, Anais Nin held high hopes for me. For instance, Jack Ketchum, my favorite horror author, named her as a big inspiration. And to me, she just always seemed to be an author enveloped in mystery, down to the dubious origin of her writing. So from what I can recall, the most fascinating aspect of her writing for me was the fact that it was entirely commissioned erotica, meaning that it was written to serve the fantasies of Nin's patrons, or something like that, I don't know. The historical details of her writing process are very blurry, and quite frankly, I didn't even care to look them up, because to me, they don't matter. So this is a collection of short stories that all read exactly the same, down to the sing-song way in which the plot just kind of brainlessly bounces in each one. So it's always like, there once was a man, and this man did this and that, and then he got a boner, and then he found a girl, and then the girl played with his boner, the end. And I guess like the airy, like almost nonchalant way in which her stories are written appeals to certain readers. And as was my disclaimer for this entire video, right? Different strokes for different folks. but please let's not talk about stroking for this book. There is enough of it. Seriously, it seems like every character is just mindlessly stroking a dick in the background of every single story. So to me, no lie, Anais Nin feels like what an untrained AI would assume erotica is. Oh, and I was told that this was disturbing because it involves underage characters, and that it does. But to me, that wasn't disturbing. It was just gross and stupid. And can you tell I'm so fucking over this book? Like, let's move on and never talk about Anais Nin on my channel ever again. So number 7 is Womb by Duncan Ralston, first published in 2016. And like Insane Bastards, this is one I barely remember, although I do recall a very important, unforgivable detail about it that set it apart from its contemporaries. I remember it tried to be intentionally funny, and let's just say it was not. For me. I should always say for me. Now, it has seriously come to a point in this video where all these extreme horror books are starting to blend in my mind. And that is due to just how similar their storytelling philosophy is. It all just feels like constant excretion of ideas. Like they're all written like story outlines. It's like brainstorming clouds and not actual threads woven together by a solid narrative. I think this one was about the dude trying to crawl into a pussy, but I could be wrong. And before any of you feel any kind of incentive to pick this up based on that statement alone, let me just tell you, at least to me personally, it's not worth it. But you go ahead and try for yourself. That's what I always say. But yes, I recall the terrible jokes and not much else. So you might even be asking, right? How can you even give a fair review to a book you barely even remember? And to that I say, I think Forgettable is as good a book review as any. Number 8 is I'm Thinking of Ending Things because they've gotten worse since we last spoke or whatever, by Ian Reid. This is from 2016, and I'll be real, I DNF'd this. I don't DNF books, okay? I hardly ever sit a book down and say, I can't anymore, this sucks. So that should tell you something. But I should say I didn't DNF it because the writing was more grammatically atrocious than Insane Bastards, because it's not. And I didn't DNF it because it was even more cringe-worthy than Womb, because it wasn't. It was simply because I didn't care. And I guess that speaks to something positive about all these extreme horror books that are on this list, okay? We can talk all the smack we want about them, but I read every single one of them from cover to cover, so maybe there's something there. Now, I know, we've got another critically lauded book on the list. And if you loved it, that's great, and that's what literature is about, dissenting opinions, we love them. To me, however, this was kind of at the opposite spectrum of something like Insane Bastards, where it is trying to achieve something entirely different, but through similarly grating and amateurish means. So whereas Insane Bastards pines to be shocking and gross, this book to me was desperate to be mysterious and mind-bending. And where Insane Bastards piles on the gore and guts to try to achieve its purpose, this book does something very similar, but just tying together exhausting perspective shifts and psychoanalytic fluff and just making an utter mess of its characters' interiorities. To me, it's the same kind of pretentiousness, but in different packaging. And also, I understand there's a big twist at the end, and I did look up what the twist is, and it just made me glad that I DNF'd this. Now, number 9 is Innocent World by Ami Sakurai from 1996, a novel from Japan. This is translated by Stephen Clark, and some astute viewers might be shocked to see this here, given that this was actually one of my entries on one of my previous Disturbing Books videos. So what is it doing here? Well, I feel that this novel is a unique case of an exploration of a topic that feels so singular that it must be discussed, yet sadly, the singular example we have at hand is not very good. This novel explores the concept of underage sex work in Japan, and particularly as it relates to adolescent ennui and numbness, which tend to be very prominent themes in Japanese transgressive fiction. Alienation of the body, brutality, all of these things warrant a broader discussion when it comes to sex work in Japan, yet I felt that Ami Sakurai leaned much too heavily on the shock value and not to any kind of surprising or illuminating effect. To be quite frank, some of the narrative even gave me Go Ask Alice sensationalist vibes, And the violence and character studies in here are much too moralizing, I feel, to be coming from any kind of place of sincerity. There's also just very unfortunate depictions of mental illness and disabilities here, again, because they seem to be coming from this gratuitous and sensationalist angle. And I don't know, I just always have a problem with narratives like that. So compared to the rest of the list, this is not the worst disturbing book by any means, but I thought the frail balance that it rode between seriousness and exploitation was interesting enough to bring to the discussion. So, yeah. And now, finally, number 10, Talia by Daniel Volpe from 2021. I'm being fully honest here. I know I said we were only going by author's last name, but it is quite serendipitous that this lands on the last spot, because I'm pretty sure this is the worst book that I have ever read. So comparing it to its contemporaries like The Slob and Insane Bastards and Womb, it pretty much violates every single offense those other titles are guilty of, but with the added novelty that this feels much less edited than the rest, even less than Insane Bastards. I had, in all truth, never read a published work, self-published or otherwise, that quite frankly read like an unrevised first draft. I don't know if the manuscript has been updated since, because you can do that through KDP even after you publish your book, but I read it months after it came out, and all the errors were still very much intact, so I don't know how much things have changed by now. So on my first read, I try to give it the benefit of the doubt. You know, self-publishing is so difficult, and having to edit your own work must be a nightmare, or at least that is what I thought back then. Now, however, coming back to this after having self-published my own work, I can say that yes, it is difficult and can be a nightmare, but it is by no means impossible. Most importantly, you are charging people money for your work, so at least give it a read-through or something, I don't know. And you know, some mistakes are allowed. You know, I'm sure there's a handful of errors in Poking Holes, my book. But I can say with full certainty that someone will look at my book and go, you know what, at the very least, there is an understanding of grammar here. And that was not the case for Talia. Look, I have read many indie works with syntax and grammar errors, but there are usually only a handful and far in between, so I can ignore them just fine. So trust me when I tell you, the mistakes here are unignorable to me. Moreover, when we get into the actual details of the story, well, bad grammar can't help but devolve into just generally bad writing, I feel. But besides the laughable descriptions of violence, besides the nonsensical, derivative, and repetitive plot progression, besides the cartoonish characters that feel completely inadequate for delivering the emotional resonance of a revenge story, besides all of that, I want to impart a lesson with Talia. And that lesson is a lesson of subtlety. Subtlety, I think, is something that most of the works featured on this list could greatly benefit from. Now, I understand these works probably don't want to be subtle, and they seem to have garnered fan bases just fine the way they are. So what do I know, right? Still, I thought these books were terrible, so I guess I'll just give you what advice I'd give to anyone who would be willing to listen. So let's go back to basics, alright? Let's go back to a seminal work of disturbing horror fiction that I'm sure writers like Volpe and Beauregard and Garrett would name as a huge inspiration, as would I. The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. Now, many of you know this book only by name and reputation, for I know many of my viewers have told me that they have no plans to ever read it. Yes, this is highly regarded as one of the most disturbing horror novels ever written. Now, let's go back to Talia. How does Talia begin? It begins with a man being fucked by a giant fire extinguisher-sized dildo. Pretty fucking edgy, right? Now, it makes sense for an extreme horror novel to start like this, though, doesn't it? After all, you want to establish the extreme tone right off the bat. But what's the problem with this? Well, to me, the problem is that if a novel purports to be extreme horror, then as a reader, I expect the extreme part to be the takeaway. You know, the impact, the most significant collision that I am about to experience with this piece of fiction. However, to begin a novel like this, to me, feels like revealing your secret weapon much too early. Like you're offering the main course before the appetizer, and from here on, one of two things is going to happen. Either nothing is ever going to quite hit that initial shock that you revealed on your first page, rendering the rest of the novel useless, or the more common route, the author is going to try to outdo all his previous shocks by mounting more ridiculous detail to the point where the narrative becomes either tedious or completely non-existent. The fire extinguisher-sized dildo is pretty much the only note that Talia plays. It downright flatlines trying to play at shock. And that is why all these novels not only have their plot details blend in my mind, but the novels themselves start to blend with other similar novels since they all follow the same formula. And now let's go back to The Girl Next Door. Well, gee, with such a fearsome reputation behind it, can you imagine how this novel starts? There's gotta be heads flying off his shoulders right off the bat, right? Just a fucking avalanche of blood and shit raining down from the heavens on the first page. Well, not quite. Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door begins with the account of a young boy fishing, sitting by the placid surface of a nearby pond, and then a girl approaches him, a girl he's never met before, and the two strike up a pleasant conversation as they continue their afternoon fishing. And that's it. That's the first chapter. And from that moment, this boy's relationship with this girl starts to ripple out, slowly at first, then with more and more unbridled rage, until finally the narrative just explodes into unbearable brutality. But what makes this unbearable and Talia a chore to read? Well, I'd say part of it is because we have something to compare the unbearable brutality to. The novel hasn't just made us familiar with brutality, it familiarized us with comfort and peace as well. It gave us something to look back to with sickened longing when shit hits the fan. Moreover, the violence in The Girl Next Door is nowhere near as explicit as the violence in Talia, and yet it is a million times more impactful because the violence doesn't live in grandiose details. It lives in subtle descriptions. It lives in the small snippets of senses of touch and sight and smell that are so familiar to us. And most importantly, it lives in silence, in the unfilled corners of the narrative that Ketchum was smart enough to know his readers would try to fill with their own worst thoughts. And that can all happen when an author slows down, when they don't dole out transgression desperately hoping to shock, and when they give their readers enough time to truly consider what's at the end of their fork. See, what narratives like Talia fail to recognize is that disturbing your readers works in more than one way. It works in more than one note. And when one way doesn't work, well, maybe it's time to consider being a little more subtle, alright? Alright, that's the end of the video. I hope no one got too angry. Again, these are all just my opinions, my reactions. Nothing set in stone. I'm no expert. We can all like what we like and hate what we hate. And in the spirit of such positivity, why don't you let me know what the most disappointing, disturbing book you've ever read has been? And why was it Poking Holes by Juan Valencia? No, but seriously, what are your usual problems with disturbing books? Are they not disturbing enough? Are they too boring? Bad grammar? Written by an overgrown, edgy teen? I want to hear all about it. And thank you once again to all the lovely people whose names are scrolling across the screen. Your donations are still truly appreciated and they're still a true life changer. And as always, I hope you're all well. Continue to stay safe and I'll see you in the next one.